Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta. And in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. All right, welcome back to Season 3, the Fighter Pilot Professor, second episode. I am your host, Meta, as always. Excited that you're here. Please keep shooting me your questions, liking me, following me, Instagram, the Fighter Pilot Professor, and on YouTube, the same, the Fighter Pilot Professor. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about a topic that I am straying into with some trepidation, American politics. And then also we'll be talking about, are skills learned or are they innate? And how do I know the difference if I have like an innate skill in doing something or a learned skill? And how do I overcome one thing or the other? We'll jump right in. Here we go. So, frankly, I am a little worried about jumping into this topic, but it is election season here in the United States, so I think it's important to talk a little bit about it. Disclaimer, right? I'm not going to talk ideology. I'm really not even going to weigh in with my opinion on any of these topics. I'm just going to try to lay out some basics about how U.S. elections work. I think that's important to know, like, what's the process for how it works. Obviously, recently, former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris had a debate, and, I'm not going to delve into that. But, around that discussion, a lot of people asked me, like, how did Kamala Harris get to be a candidate when, President Biden was the Democratic nominee and a bunch of stuff like that, right? And then also a lot of people have asked me about, like, what is it that makes American politics so divisive currently? And that's like a whole can of worms. I'm not going to jump into the whole like social cultural things that are going on in the U.S., but I will delve into some of the like mechanical things that kind of get us to where we are and lead us to this semi-divided politics, right? So to start off with, as Tip O'Neill once said, all politics is local, right? And that's definitely true about the United States. The Constitution actually has surprisingly little to say about elections, right? In largely, the election process is delegated to the states. There are a few amendments that address specific voting, right? So people of color, former slaves being able to vote, women being able to vote, right? Changing the way the Constitution did that. The Voting Rights Act largely dictates the process for voting, but for the most part, the process for holding elections, even presidential elections, is delegated to the states by the Constitution. And so that means that there is this pretty sort of Wild Westy sort of element to how presidents are selected for the major parties and how we go about doing elections, right? I'll jump into kind of discussion of primaries first. Primaries are like, they don't really exist in the Constitution. They kind of do, but not really, beyond sort of regulation through the Voting Rights Act. But it's really up to the states to determine how they put candidates on the ballot. And there's a variety of ways that candidates can be put on the ballot, but the primary election is the primary way to do it. And some states do caucuses like Iowa, which are sort of a town hall version of primaries. I'm not going to delve into the difference, but at any rate, the states decide how they're going to put candidates on the ballot. And the usual way between the Democratic and Republican Party is that there are primaries for the various states, and those states obviously select their candidates. Those candidates are not actually selected at all there. The you're actually selecting delegates for those candidates when you vote in a primary. And those delegates go to the Republican or Democratic convention, and then they in turn vote at the convention for those delegates. This is a similar process to the Electoral College. And the reason why we have these super complicated, but the bottom line is that we have to remember that the U.S. is ultimately not a pure democracy, but a representative republic democracy, which means that the individuals, i.e. us, the citizens, don't necessarily go to and vote specifically on laws. We send representatives, hence House, Congress, city councilmen at the local level, etc., right? And those people are meant to represent us in our various state, local, national government entities, right? So in a lot of cases, especially with president, right, we are not actually specifically directly electing the president, but electing representatives to represent us to elect the president, which makes it a weird process. But again, the founding fathers sort of developed some of these things as a means of sort of balancing the system of population and equal representation, right? So more powerful states like in the colonial era and early Republican era, like New York, Virginia, obviously had a much larger population, and so they were in favor of these population-based systems like the House, right? Other smaller states like Rhode Island, South Carolina, for example, are in favor of equal representation like the Senate. So we get this weird mix of population and equal representation formats when we go to the election as well, right? And so this democratic representative republic develops this sort of series of representatives to carry out our will in the various elections. And that's basically what's happening at primaries and at the Electoral College. Obviously, there's a lot more complications than that, but that's the big thing, right? The second part of it is like, how do we get so divided in some of these things? And I'm not gonna go too deep into this, but one of the many things that like divide Americans, but one of the things that contributes to this sort of division, and also it's the same thing that contributes to why there are really only two major political parties in current day, the Republicans and the Democrats. And the answer is that the United States mostly has a winner-take-all majority system. And what do I mean by that? So, for example, when we're talking about primary elections or electoral college elections or even Senate representation, House representation, you need a majority, i.e. more than 50%, to be elected. But once you achieve that majority, then you automatically win that election, right? So all you need is 50.1% to beat your opponent, 49.9% of the vote, and bang, you are the winner. So you collect all the delegates as it relates to primaries or electoral college, or in the case of the House and the Senate, you win the approval or denial of a bill or something like that, right? And what that means is unlike our parliamentary systems where you just need most of the votes. So, for example, to become prime minister in the British parliamentary system, you really only need more votes than your opponent. So, in theory, right, the ruling prime minister's party could have only garnered, say, 30% of the representative vote in parliament, and they would become the prime minister. This leads to a diffusion of parties in places with parliamentary democracies, primarily in Europe and other places. But in the United States, because we have this winner-take-all 51-49 rule, right, we largely it doesn't make any sense to have more than two parties because you dilute the vote because you need that 51% to win. So the winner-loser game doesn't really work if you divide it into three. Then everybody gets a third, for example, right? One person gets 35%, but they don't have 50%. And 50% is what you need to win the day in almost every election. And so that creates this automatic party system. And going all the way back to like George Washington, for example, he was not a fan of parties, but even then, right, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were debating some of the same topics that we're debating today about, like, what's the role of the federal government? How big should it be? How do we fund? What do we do with our taxes, et cetera, et cetera? Some of these same very debates that we're having today played out even in the earliest days of the Republic. And because we have this winner-take-all 51-49 winning system, it leads to this automatic division of, like, I'm either for something or I'm against something. And that automatically divides the line, because ultimately, no matter where I fall on the political spectrum, no matter what the issue is, ultimately I have to vote for or against that thing. Or my representative in Congress or the Senate has to vote for or against that thing. And it's a sort of a black and white choice, right? And while there is tons of nuance in American political life and in American culture, right, ultimately when we go to the polls, it's a black and white choice. And so that black and white choice, in my opinion, is what drives a lot of this division, is that I am forced to choose, no matter kind of how I feel about the issue. I'm forced to choose yes or no, A or B, one or the other, right? And that choice is what automatically starts to divide us, because you have to pick that side. So that's, I know it's tough. I know that this is maybe an unpleasant topic for some people, right? But I think it's important to think about as we start heading to the polls here in a couple of months. As always, keep shooting me your questions. Like me, follow me, YouTube and Instagram, Fighter Pilot Professor, and wherever you get your podcasts out there. So, one of the things that people say often is, like, leaders are born or not made. And I don't know about that. But, we do have some, I would say, like, innate abilities, however you want to call it, right? God-given talents, whatever it is. Like, I know, like, I've always been this way, that I'm naturally good at being a pilot, right? I am not naturally good at solving word puzzles. Just how it is, right? But I can throw away my natural talents, and I can develop things that I'm not very good at. So, like, what do I do? Like, how do I know what I'm good at or not good at, or what do I need to practice at, or what that kind of stuff? And I would say, like, one of the ways that you would know if something is sort of a natural talent for you is like also usually something that you're passionate about, right? So I'm passionate about flying, and I have a natural talent for it. So those two things kind of go hand in hand. For you to be successful at the highest level of one thing or another, be it flying, sports, whatever, right? You have to have some of those things, right? You have to have a talent for it. Obviously, I'm not going to make it in the NFL. I can't throw a football very far, right? But Tom Brady could, right? Like, arguably, Tom Brady could, like, go back out there and do the thing again, right? Maybe not. I don't know. But you get the point, right? Is that you have to have a natural talent for exceeding at the highest level. Additionally, you have to have a passion for it. Why? Because it's hard. It takes a long time to be excellent at a thing, right? And then 3, you have to put the work in, right? Obviously, we've talked about, like, putting in the grind to do all these things, right? But you can apply to some of those same principles to things that you're not really all that good at, right? So, like, I'm not all that good at word puzzles, right? So, I mean, frankly, what do I do to get better? Like, in my world as an academic, the professor part of my fighter pilot professor, I have to have good words, right? I have to have the best words, and so I need to be able to develop my vocabulary. It's not something that I am, like, naturally attuned to. So what do? I do crosswords. I do word puzzles. I, like, force myself to do this. Do I enjoy it? Not always, sometimes, but not always. Am I good at it? No. But nevertheless, just the mere fact of me doing it makes me better at it, and it improves me in some other way, right? So, even if I have a natural talent for something, if I don't put in the work, obviously it's never going to go anywhere, right? So if I had never practiced and studied and all the things about being a fighter pilot, then I would have never been a very good one. Arguably, I am the best. So, it means I put in a lot of work. But on the flip side, right, I can develop the things that I'm not naturally gifted for, math, words, swimming, whatever, right? Like there are things that I can do. Now, in a lot of cases, especially in like physical events like sports or whatever, like you may hit a ceiling, right? Because I just don't run that fast, or I can't jump that high, and like I can train and lift and do all these things, and I'm still never going to be a world-class athlete. But that's okay, right? In most things in life, I don't have to be world-class. I just need to improve that weakness, right? So if you find something that you don't have a great like love for, a passion for, or whatever, but it's part of your life and integral, right? Like then go out and practice that thing. And it may be unpleasant, frankly, right? Like you might not like doing it. But if it's important enough, right, you can put the work in to make yourself better at it. Now, obviously, you may never be world class, but at least you'll be sufficient enough to live your life. And then you can go out and be world class at the things you really like, right? So I hope that helps. As always, keep shooting me your questions, like and follow on Instagram and on YouTube, Fighter Pilot Professor. And you can get this podcast wherever you get your podcast. Have a good day.